the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, we meet the aliens and find that they are us. The sorcerers who rule the world go down for the count. And a band of survivors learns to thrive on a hostile alien planet. All that, plus my conversation with Charles E. Gannon and Robert E. Waters about 1636 CALABAR'S War. And we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of David Weber's Uncompromising Honor. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I'm Baen Consulting Editor David Afsharirad. Today, we bring you my conversation with Charles E. Gannon and Robert E. Waters. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I'm Baen Consulting Editor David Afsharirad, sitting in for Tony Daniel. Today, we bring you my conversation with Charles E. Gannon and Robert E. Waters about their new novel, 1636 CALABAR'S War. CALABAR'S War is, of course, part of Eric Flint's best-selling Ring of Fire series, and it was great to sit down and talk with Chuck and Robert about the series as a whole and where CALABAR'S War fits in. We talked about the themes in the novel, as well as the swashbuckling plot and daring characters who are found therein. It's a conversation that I think will appeal to longtime fans of this landmark alternate history series, as well as newcomers. But first, the news. The April mass market paperbacks are in. First up, Starborn and Godsons by Larry Niven, Jerry Purnell, and Stephen Barnes. This is the long-awaited conclusion to the military science fiction epic, The Legacy of Hero series. Avalon was finally thriving. The cold sleep colonists from Earth had settled on a verdant, livable world, but unbeknownst to the planet-bound humans, something was moving out there in the stars. Its destination, Avalon. Its probable origin, Earth's solar system. Next up, we have Castaway Resolution by Eric Flint and Reich E. Spoor. The Kimmy family and the second group of castaways, led by the redoubtable Sergeant Campbell, have finally joined forces, landing on the bizarre planet Lincoln. But the resourcefulness of the castaways may not be enough, because the planet Lincoln is far from done with them. And finally, The Initiate by James L. Cambius. The Apkallu are masters of magic. They rule the world from the shadows, using mind control and deadly monsters to eliminate any threat to their power. Sam Arcaro lost his family to a demon sent by the Apkallu. He knows that nobody would believe the truth, but now an old man offers Sam the chance to find out who is responsible and bring down the Apkallu forever. And that's it for the news. Now, my conversation with Charles E. Gannon and Robert E. Waters about their new novel, 1636, CALABAR'S War. We're here with Charles E. Gannon and Robert E. Waters. They are the co-authors of the new Ring of Fire series entry, 1636, CALABAR'S War. Is out now in trade paperback and ebook formats wherever fine books are sold. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming on the Baen Free Radio Hour.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So this is number 30. I looked it up right before we came on the air here, or started recording rather, in the Ring of Fire series. Sort of way back when with Eric Flint's 1632 was the first novel in the series, and it's really become a touchstone, a landmark in the alternate history genre, and has spawned just this fascinating web of authors, co-authors, and we call it fan fiction. It's not really even fan fiction with the Grantville Gazettes, and it's just really become an interesting multi-author project, I guess is one way to think of it. And I imagine most people watching this or listening to it are familiar with it a little bit, but if we could just take a second to one of you walk us through what is the Ring of Fire, and then a little less briefly, maybe how does Calabar's War slot into the overall series?
Okay, well, as being, I guess, by a year or two, the earlier participant in Ring of Fire starts actually asynchronously in 1631 in what's called the old timeline. That is the past. It's this the series opens with in the last months of the 20th century, this effect that takes place in a small town in Virginia, patterned after Mannington, I believe it is, in this place called Grantville. Hence, you'll hear Grantville show up a lot in references to the Ring of Fire, 1632. And it is a small town, mining town in West Virginia. There is a ball of light that grabs up a sphere of terrain from that time, space, location, and swaps it with one in 1631 in Thuringia in Germany. It swaps it in such a place also that they are emerging within days of a fateful battle at which Gustavus Adolphus, the king of Sweden at that time, is killed, known as the Lion of the Lutheran Lion, or of the North, and that changed the course of the war. However, the folks of Grantville, for a variety of reasons, get involved in a set of unusual ways that event is changed. Gustavus Adolphus does not die. The war, the 30 Years' War, sort of changes and is sort of foreshortened, and the story goes forward, largely tracking at first the events and how the people of Grantville deal with this change. And the changes they bring to this world. As the novels go on, more and more of the story arcs move into what are called the downtimers. Downtimers are people who come from the 1631 of this changed world, which is now called the new timeline, the point at which it diverges from the timeline we would find in our history books. That's called the new timeline. And the downtimers of the new timeline are being very, very rapidly changed. In a lot of ways, far more rapidly changed than the uptimers, who have to adapt. But imagine getting 350 years of and there's a high school, people, so many alternate histories. A gun comes through, or a car comes through, or something like that, or somebody has one piece of knowledge. In this case, the most strategically, tactically, and culturally influential innovation or introduction from our timeline is the high school library. And if you think about the obvious things, and then all the subtle things that does, are just, they have an immense impact. And Grantville in many ways becomes one of the new centers of the world, although not a great city, just a place that everybody's scholars and everybody's spies go there. And that's kind of the broad sweep of it.
Yeah, and as you said, early on in the novels, primarily focus on that more narrow arc of story of what's going on there, but they do spread out, and I think that's part of the appeal of this series, which we can maybe talk about, is that I think in the ad copy a lot of times we'll use the term ripple effect, right? It has a ripple effect going out and out from this one place. And Calabar's War takes place kind of on the other side, almost other side of the Atlantic, not quite the other side of the world. So when in the timeline, and what is going on, and where are we located in this novel that you gentlemen have written?
I can take that one. Yeah, so like you said, there's ripple effects, and the series has broadened itself out from Europe. Calabar's War fits into the storyline that is developing in the New World. It takes place in the Americas. Specifically, it takes place in South America and in the Caribbean. The actual start date of the novel, actually, it goes back a little bit. The series itself is progressed from the first novel, 1632. We're now up into 1637. Most of the novels now, the main novels now, even sideline novels that are published by Baen are now established in 1637. This one goes back a little bit. It actually starts in 1633. It basically begins at the aftermath of the pretty devastating Battle of Dunkirk, where the Dutch are basically ambushed and damaged considerably their fleet, and they kind of hobble themselves across the Atlantic and go to Brazil. Calabar's War begins in Brazil. The main thrust of the novel begins around 1634. So this goes back in time a little bit, and it starts in 1634, and it begins to basically recount Admiral Tromp's arrival, the Dutch Admiral Tromp in Brazil, comes into Brazil, and the exodus of the Dutch from there into the Caribbean, and that's how it goes. So basically it starts, there are 4 novels now set in the Americas. 3 of them that deal with our area of operation. You've got the first one, 1636, Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. You've got the one that just came out last May, 1637, No Peace Beyond the Line, and now you have 1636, Calabar's War. Calabar's War actually basically begins before 1636, Commander Cantrell, and then it parallels actions within there, and then it stops right before 1637, No Peace Beyond the Line. So that's where it fits. It fits into the New World storyline, down in into Caribbean and into Brazil.
And just in case anybody was getting lost with the timeline and thinking, has it really been that long since No Peace Beyond the Line has come out? Actually, it came out in November. So if you haven't gotten to it yet, it's not like you've overlooked something for a year.
Absolutely.
It's more like about five months at this point.
Yeah, about 5 months at the moment.
So let's talk a little bit about the let's talk about we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how this book, its journey to publication. Let's talk about that, and then we'll jump into sort of the plot.
This one has been a long time coming, and I met Chuck many years ago, 2009, 2010, I think. He invited me to join the series and maybe write in the series. I took about a year, though, to read in the series. Back in those days, it was not as large, so it was not that hard to get into it at that point. I read all the mainline novels, many of the anthologies, some of the short stories, and then I started writing in the series. At some point along the way, a year, 2 years into writing stories, primarily for the Grantville Gazette, he invites me. So I try my hand at it, and he invites me to write this story about Calabar and Brazil. Now, the original intention of the story was to be a novella. It was supposed to be just a novella about Admiral Tromp's arrival. And by the way, the pronunciation of Recife, R-E-C-I-F-E, is Recife. That's how the Portuguese pronounce it. They pronounce it with the H sound, Recife. Sometimes it's a little tough. Sometimes some of the languages switch pronunciations and stuff, but it is Recife. His arrival there, his decision to move the Dutch out of Brazil into the Caribbean. Now, this is all handled or discussed in Commander Cantrell in the West Indies, so this isn't anything new in the storyline so far. So we wrote the novella, and like Chuck said, it sat and it sat and it sat. Time went by. The schedule for what was going to be published in the series just sort of switched. The nature of we were going to have it in a New World anthology. It was going to be part of a New World anthology, but the nature of that anthology changed. And so Calabar kind of didn't have a home for a bit. And so Chuck calls me on the phone one day after we met in LibertyCon and said, "Hey, let's make it a novel. We've already got around 35,000 words. Why not just make it a novel?" And so this was back in 2014 or 2015.
Oh, wow, that long ago. Huh?
Exactly, yeah. Absolutely. And
that's after it's been sitting around as a novella for 2 or 3 years.
yeah. And at one point I thought, well, this is never going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So I said, sure, let's do it. And so, we got onto it, got the contract, started outlining it, started plotting it. And, one thing led to the other, and here we are. But it's been at least a 7-8 year journey. Believe it or not, it has been that long in the process.
Yeah, and a lot of this has to do with going back to what you were saying, David, that there are kind of I don't know if this was your first intro or the one we're recording now, but
Yeah.
but that in a lot of ways this series is kind of it's both a benchmark and unique. One of the ways in which it is unique is with all the people who've come into it, and I believe in my last conversation with Eric, something like 200 people have now been involved in the writing of it at one level or another. I don't know if that's 200 total fiction and nonfiction, because believe it or not, you might say, how could there be nonfiction for something that is got time travel? Which by the way was we don't talk much about this anymore, but the time travel was induced by irresponsible alien art from eons ago. If that sounds crazy enough for you, well, then you want to find out about it. Read the book. Actually, that hasn't been mentioned since the first book, but there's a series that are connected to it called Time Spike, which does traffic in that origin a little bit. But the bottom line is, as you get more people coming in, it actually has an impact on where the series goes. For instance, I came in largely, when you get right down to it, I started also with a novella that Eric said, I'm going to use it for the New World anthology. So now we're back in 2010. Okay. I haven't written Papal Stakes yet. I haven't written Exodus, my first full novel for Baen. And, but he says, I like it. I'm going to use it. I'm going to buy it. And I sat there and I was looking at what else was going on in the series. And one of the things that was going on in the series is, as folks will quickly see, is that after the first book, David Weber jumps in for, I believe, 2 books in the main line. And these are the 3, this is sort of the holy trinity. If you want to know what's going on, and you can almost track all arcs back to what goes on in those first 3 books. And I looked at that and I said, David Weber, such a guy with such an empty dance card. I'm sure he's going to be able to do the Honor Harrington project and Safehold, but just in case he can't, and so I had in my mind that I was going to save that. And lo and behold, it became the basis for, I became, in a sense, no one can replace David Weber, but certainly I filled the same slot on the batting order when it came to naval combat at that time in the New World. And so lo and behold, I take that novella that I wrote that Eric said he was going to publish, and it becomes part of the story that ultimately becomes Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. Meanwhile, before that's even happened and come to fruition, I'm talking to Robert Waters with Eric's blessing, saying, we've got this idea for a story. Good, let me see it. So he writes it, and we take a look at it. And it won't work for the New World anthology anymore, because at this point now we're thinking more everything, it's North America, Caribbean and North America. And as time goes on, even that changes. Caribbean becomes so involved in its own stories that the New World anthology, as I believe it is conceptualized now, is that it's going to be, I think it's just, as a matter of fact, the cover art just came out recently.
Yeah, it's on the schedule.
Coast of Chaos.
Yeah,
Coast of Chaos, I think. And so that novel has finally come to be more than 10 years after, or 12 years after that was envisioned. But 2 novels grew up out of it. You might almost say 3, possibly 4, because Commander Cantrell grew up out of that. No Peace Beyond the Line grew up out of Commander Cantrell. And then second generation, CALABAR'S War grew up out of the notion of this. So it's been both a long gestation period, but it's also been a sort of broodery. It's breeding new offspring, novel length offspring, as we've waited for it to come about.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So let's jump in and talk about it a little bit. If you guys even remember it, had you remember writing this? It's been so long. But
we
what
remember.
book are we talking about? What?
Yeah. So let's just set up sort of the main plot problem, I guess, if you would, and tell us who, Robert mentioned these pronunciations, so I'm probably going to get them all wrong because I don't speak Portuguese or Spanish very well.
Well,
I'm
neither
going to do
do
the
I.
same thing. I'm going to wind up calling it Recife simply because Recife sounds too much like hissy fit. So I'm going to I'm going to go with my own mispronunciation. Please Portuguese speakers for everywhere, forgive me.
So who is Domingos Fernandez Calabar, and what is his war? I guess is the question. You know, how does what is this book? I guess what's the main crux of the book about as far as him as a character?
All right, Domingos Fernandez Calabar is what the Portuguese called at the time a Mameluco. He was a part Portuguese, part Brazilian native. He served the Portuguese in Brazil, and specifically in Recife, and also in the captaincy of Pernambuco, which is the main province there. He served them as a plantation owner, but he also served as a military scout and an advisor. He was really good at that sort of thing. He had a good sense of topography, he had a good sense of the lay of the land. He understood the people very well. So the Portuguese used him in that capacity. But when the Dutch show up in the beginning of the 1630s, 1630, 1631, for some reason he switches sides and he changes his allegiance to the Dutch. Now, history doesn't specifically state why he did this, but he does. And in doing so, of course, ticks off the Portuguese to no end. In the real world, he actually gets captured and executed, but not until he actually becomes a folk hero for the Brazilian populations and peoples in there. And even to this day, he is considered an important historical figure in the history of Brazil.
Controversial, it should also be said.
Exactly, very much. And so his involvement in this novel comes about by the fact that Admiral Tromp comes across the Atlantic from the devastation at the Battle of Dunkirk and comes to Recife. The plan for him, of course, at Tromp, is to hightail it out, get the Dutch out of Brazil, because they just cannot hold, because of the changing nature in Europe. They can't hold that holding. It's too strong. There's too many dangers there. They've got to get out. That's where Calabar comes into the story. He's already in the history, in the real history, he's already changed sides. So he's there, and so when Tromp arrives, he begins to serve him to figure out a good, decent way to get the Dutch out of. That's where we begin.
Yeah,
and just to frame up a little bit,
sure.
The reason that they have to Recife at this point, Recife, is genuine. It's a place of major investment. It was a sort of a long reach for the Dutch. They had been trying to establish a toehold in some place in Pernambuco in Brazil since the late 1620s. And this is in real life, this is where Maurice of Nassau comes in, and just a little bit after this, and actually for quite some time, Recife is a major location in the New World, is a major source of sugar, and really is developed as a city in a way that none of the Portuguese cities are developed. It also never turns a profit. And the reason for that is the constant defense requirements and the constant ship losses. Now, in this situation, the big change is that the Battle of Dunkirk, which you just heard Robert mention, this essentially not only devastates the Dutch fleet, but they now no longer, it winds up with the blockade of Amsterdam and all of their other ports. They have no way to support their global colonies at this point, which is there are major investments. The Dutch East India Company, which is every place from the Philippines down to Indonesia. They have a variety of holdings there. And the Dutch West India Company, which is at this point is just starting, makes an initial foothold in the Caribbean, in St. Eustatia, but was more focused on South America. So what has happened is, without the ability to constantly send all those, the defense personnel, the ships, the guns, the gunpowder, all of that sort of logistical tail, Trump correctly analyzes this situation and says, in 18 months, we're going to be dead. We have to leave now while we can. And that is what precipitates this as something other than just, this is more than just a good idea. This is a survival decision.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the, because one thing I like about this book, and I guess the series in general, is how it, of course, with the whole breadth of everything, especially, but even within this novel and within other specific stories, novels, how we have the big socio-political stuff, and then also the very human element. And so that's sort of the background of what's going on with all this. But then this story really, I really liked Calabar, and I liked him as a hero and as a character because of his sort of personal, I guess struggles, and maybe isn't even the right word, but his his character arc, I guess, would just be the easiest way to say that. And I don't know how, I think, well, we give this away on the back of the book so we can talk about it. So he is seen, like you said, as a traitor to the Portuguese. And so what's his name? Matthias, I can't remember his last name, pointed it out for him. So we can talk about that, and then what happens maybe to his, as a result of this feud, I guess you would call it.
Say again.
I'm just talking about what happens to his family, and that kind of drives this. I would say the second part of the novel.
Right.
I didn't want to give away spoilers, but it's on the back of the book, so I guess we can't call it a spoiler.
Well, when Calabar switches his allegiance from the Portuguese to the Dutch, his family is in danger. I mean, that's just the facts, and he is in danger. He's in danger every time he steps out the front door of his house. So he's had to move his family. He's got a wife and he's got 3 children. Celia is his wife, Martin, Lua, and Carlos are his children. And they live in Recife under Dutch protection. So he really lives on the edge, really in a very precarious and dangerous place, where, as I say, every time he walks out the door, he could potentially be captured and executed, which is what happens to him in real life. And he actually had a pretty reasonably decent, I don't know if how personal it was with Matthias, but he had served Matthias, and Matthias knew him, so he took it personally, the switch, the change of allegiance. So, but the fact that he's called a traitor really hurts him personally, hurts Calabar personally, because in his mind he doesn't think himself a traitor. He's serving his people, he's serving his people, he's serving his family. So the notion that he is a traitor really weighs heavily on his mind, and it affects, in many ways, the decisions that he makes going throughout the novel, especially later on in the novel, like you say, when he's got to make a real hard decision about continuing to sort of serve the Dutch or go in the other direction and protect his family.
And so then there's also this, I also want to talk about the character, what's his last name? Moses, the captain, Moses Eames. Can you tell us a little bit about him? And how
Moses Cohen Henriquez Eames, or Agnes. I don't know how to exactly pronounce that last thing myself. Yeah, Moses is great. Sephardic pirate, Jewish pirate. He served the Dutch as a pirate. Historical. Absolutely, he's a historical figure. In fact, his real claim to fame historically was the Battle of Matanzas, the Bay of Matanzas, where he helped the Dutch capture the Spanish silver fleet, I think, near Cuba, or in the Bay of Cuba there in Matanzas. And that happened prior to the Ring of Fire. That happened in 1628, I believe. So he's very well known. He's very famous. He is very well connected with the Jewish population and the Jewish communities in Brazil and in Recife and Pernambuco. In fact, Antonio Vaz, later on, he actually takes that island as sort of his own, and he sort of does. Of course, it doesn't happen that way in the novel.
We would have been, we would have had to have been the narrative equivalent of tone deaf, not to see that there was a throne essentially being a theme delivered to us, which is the world of marginalized peoples and characters. You're dealing with Calabar, who is of 2 societies, and the society that was the more powerful, the colonizer, if you will, once he certainly never saw him as an equal when he worked for them, and then when he no longer does, this is the great betrayal, because of course they did him such a great favor by employing him to begin with and treating him almost like he was one of them. And certainly you have the same thing with Moses, in that he's again, why is it that there are so many people of Jewish and Sephardic background in the New World? Because there's so few. They go where they can to make a living, because so many places are dangerous or prohibited to them. So you have that. Then you have his wife Celia, and then of course, as the novel goes on, the increasing depiction of the slave peoples and the slave trade, which is, this book is the first in the entire series that really jumps on that. And that was a major concern to us, because I think it's safe to say we were conscious of the fact that in a perfect world, this book would have been written by people whose background stems from that origin. As it was, there was nobody around who was doing it, and it seemed to me that it was, and I think both of us, it's, well, we can do it or it can go unspoken, and it seemed to me that unspoken was worse than being spoken by people of our origins, rather than the origins of the people who lived through all these atrocities and horrors. And so the book just, the story, I should say, the story just kept on coming back to this issue of what it is to be oppressed, what it is to be marginalized, how you fight, who you can make friends with, how much you can trust those friends. I find that the most interesting, the Spanish and the Dutch are pretty easy to I don't want to be overly harsh, but the bottom line is, as imperialist powers, they were amongst the most harsh. And for anybody who thinks that they do harsh business in this book, you need to look up the history of how the Spanish eliminated the native people called the Taino of Hispaniola. It's spelled Taino. It stands head and shoulders with the Holocaust. Not in terms of, almost in terms of numbers, but it's amazing that it could even be done, given the number of Spanish involved and the relatively primitive conditions under which they were having to embark upon their final solution on that particular body of land. So this was just right there for us to work with, and it really informed a lot of our choices. And it also led to some of the gestation, because we really wanted to get it right. We wanted to get the tone right. A lot of 1632 books, as people will know, have a sort of lighthearted comedic element to them. And if it's not the main arc, there's some of it. You know, sorry for the folks who look forward to it, but you can't really talk about Middle Passage, African slavery, and have that in the book and not, in my opinion, have it be a slap in somebody's face.
Right. Yeah.
So you won't find that. Not going to find that in this book.
Yeah, Chuck's absolutely right. I mean, it was definitely a struggle along the way for us to try to strike the right tone, how we go forward dealing with this issue, especially when you get to, later on in the novel, where, we're dealing with conditions on a slave ship and in the plantation up in the Caribbean. So yeah, it was tough, but I think we did a good job, all things considered. I was very pleased with the final choices that we made.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. And I thought, go ahead, Chuck. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I'm not going to. I am mindful that I am probably not the person who can say whether we did a great job or not. Both we're authors, and once again, we don't. It's not our origins. But I can only say this much, and I know I can say this for not only Robert and for me, but Eric looked at this book 3 times, and I kept waving it under his nose, and I'm saying we have to get this right. We were, I think, as conscientious, sensitive to the story and to our limitations as the writers of the story as we could possibly be. Whether that translates into a great job, well, you folks out there are going to tell us that.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I'm probably not the right one to give you a thumbs up either, but I did think it was, I think I could tell that this was something you guys had taken very seriously and we're trying to portray accurately. And another aspect I wanted to talk about, and this kind of goes back to that sort of thing I was talking about, where we have the broad scope of things and also the very human side, which is that I was trying to search for the right words, and I was just thinking through this question. You don't present slavery as complicated, because it's not complicated, it's awful. It's morally abhorrent, and that comes across in the books, but you do portray it as complex, because I think the easy thing with this whole series would have been, Americans come to the past and we fix it, and overnight everything changes. And that's not how this series works. We've talked about the ripple effects, and it's slow. And I think you touched on that, where it would be easy to be like, well, the Americans come and we know slavery is bad, so we just end it. We end slavery. But you can't just end slavery as a small town. It took quite a bit worldwide in our own timeline to end it. And I think you guys did a good job of portraying the difficulties people would run up against in this timeline to end this terrible practice.
Well, you gotta, slavery up to the Ring of Fire. Slavery has already been in Portugal for over 100 years, and it also had been into the Caribbean for that long too. I mean, I read an account where Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had sanctioned the importation of African slaves into Hispaniola in the early 1500s. Now, it probably didn't just ignite overnight, but it's an institution that has been in place for a very long time. And a lot of people came through the Ring of Fire, but not enough, and there's certainly not enough in the theater in order to put an end to this institution overnight. It's just not going to happen. And so it's going to take time. It is complex to break down, but it is an issue that has to be addressed. Mm-hmm. We cannot, in the series, be in the New World in the capacity that we are in the series and not deal with this issue in some capacity or another.
And another thing that's very important and is unique to this timeline is that, of course, Admiral Trump never comes to the New World. That's not his bailiwick. He is an old world sailor in history and captain. What is interesting about his background is that he was actually taken captive by the North African pirates twice before he was the age of 16 or 17, I think, and was considered a slave. And so this makes him, on one level, very sensitive to slavery in the New World. But also, and you were talking about the complexities of slavery, just in terms of what we only have this one term, right? Slavery. But slavery, when you're a hostage, having been taken prisoner by a bey who is in Tunis, for instance, who's really just trying to get ransom for you, and you're almost pampered there. He says, yeah, okay, it wasn't. I didn't have free choice. That was completely taken away from me. He said, but you can't talk. I can't even begin. I can't talk about what I'm seeing in front of me because that's not what I experienced. And that's one of the things that also I think is, I hope this novel will be a springboard for a consideration of, we have this one word, slavery. What that meant in Greece, what that meant in Rome, what that meant in Africa, and what that meant in the New World, and under the different colonial powers. These are all important threads in that same grim tapestry that want to be teased out and looked at. And we just managed to get to distinguishing between a couple of the ones that have the highest contrast in this one. But yeah, it was exciting. It was exhilarating and terrifying to do that anyway. Because I mean, I can't imagine a more hot button topic.
Right.
When you get right down to it.
So now that we've made it sound like a grim exploration of slavery, let's talk about, there is a lot of fun in the book, though. It's very much swashbuckling kind of sections in there, and battles and hand-to-hand combat. And I guess I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, and also just maybe how you guys have approached writing those. That's something, to me as a writer, I'm always, my joke is like, oh no, things have to happen. How am I going to do this? Like, I want to have someone think, maybe two people talk. That's the limits of the, So what was it like? Because I think you did a great job of putting the reader, at least this reader, into the midst of all that action there.
Well, Chuck and I worked quite a while on the outline. And one of the things that we discussed early in the process was that we wanted to have as much action as possible in this novel. because this novel, as we've already discussed, it's different in many ways than other novels in the series. But there's not a lot of high level. There are some, Trump and Matthias de Albuquerque. There are a few high level guys that kind of like sit in a room and make decisions. But we're dealing with lieutenants here. We're dealing with captains. We're dealing with men in the field. You know, Calabar is a man of action. Moses is a man of action. The characters that we focus on are men of action. They take the orders and they go out and put them into practice. And so when the outline, when we were working on the outline, I made it a point to make sure that we had a sufficient amount of action going through the novel, and I wanted to make sure that we had a good amount of it that affected events for the main characters, for Moses and for Calabar, because otherwise, like you say, we'd have just people sitting around in rooms talking, and that just was not going to happen in this situation. It just did not feel right for the kind of story that we wanted to tell.
So I want to talk also about like Celia or Celia. I don't know. Again, my pronunciation.
I've heard it. My wife speaks Portuguese, and
okay.
She pronounces it Celia.
Celia.
That's
okay.
how I've been pronouncing it.
So talking about, I guess, a little bit hot button issues in that you're two guys writing a woman character, and a woman character from 1633. You know, this is a few years before the first wave of feminism, I guess, right? By just barely, maybe a couple months. You know, so but I found her to be a strong character, and I just wonder about how writing her felt and what it was like, and her character, and then also how to convey, I think what she was is a very strong female character, but without making her feel anachronistic, you know, and making her a third wave feminist or something in 1637 or 1636, you know, and how you guys were able to, I think, again, maybe I'm not the person to say, but I thought you handled it well.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
By the way, this is not a question for us guys. This is a question for Robert. As a matter of fact, really almost every question you're asking is for Robert, because I mean, I wrote a few things, but this is his book. This is his baby, and a beautiful baby it is, in a very dark crib, so to speak, and by which I mean filled with terror and malign forces surrounding it. So when I haven't had the chance to make this very clear. If there are flaws in the book, that's probably my hand. If there's great stuff in the book, you're talking to Robert.
Well, I appreciate that, Chuck. You're very kind.
I'm a Celia.
Yeah. Celia, yeah, I love Celia. And I was wondering, and maybe if you were to ask what were my favorite two characters, or what were my favorite characters in the book, Celia would absolutely be one of them. I just wrote her the way I felt like she would respond to the situation at the time. You know, she's married to a man who, as I said earlier, every time he steps out the door, he may come back as a corpse. Mm-hmm. She's got that to worry about. She's got to worry about her children. And as we know, I don't want to give away too much, but there's a problem with one of their children. Yeah. She's got to deal with the stress of knowing that her husband can be dead at any time. She's got to worry about the stress of dealing with her children. And she's not trusting. She's not very trusting. She doesn't necessarily trust the Dutch any more than she trusts the Portuguese or the Spanish or whatever. So all of that tension and all of that thing builds up sometimes. And she snaps back at Calabar from time to time, and she stands her ground. But I felt like she had to, you know, she's in a situation where she has to. Now, maybe it's a little too modern, but I just felt like under the circumstances, there was no way that I was going to write this woman as a little meek waif. You know, it just was not going to happen, because it just did not feel, and it wasn't appropriate. And then, of course, later on in the novel, when her and her children get into really bad situations, she's got to make some key decisions. And sometimes they're tough and brutal decisions, but she's got to make them in order to just survive. I mean, what she's doing is she's just biding time. You know, she's trying to live day to day to day until one day maybe she can get out of the situation that she's in. So she's tough. Yeah. And I think she comes along a really strong and a really effective character for her thing, and a good person to play off of Calabar too. because he's kind of quiet, and he's strong internally, but he's kind of quiet, and he needs somebody once in a while to to call him on his BS, occasionally. So that's how it is.
Yeah, and I think that's actually why it, for me, as I saw this, I had exactly the same sort of questions and concerns. And what I came to see is that really, if Calabar is the sort of individual we see, who is not if he was a leader, and we were going to assume he's the sort of leader who does that by denigrating others and by lording it over them and being arrogant and all the rest, it would have been difficult to see him, given that he's in the 1630s, winding up marrying a woman like Celia. But given that he's not that sort of individual, it almost becomes the point where you can't see him married to anybody but somebody like Celia, somebody who's got exactly that kind of sort of, if you will, innate autonomy that just sort of radiates out of her, and is able to navigate the roles of mother, of wife, human in a community, and her responsibility, not just to all those things, but to herself, is very consistent, to my mind, with the sort of what Calabar would define as strength, and that he would in fact look for strength rather than somebody doting. So in some ways, I think you could say that it reads as modern, but I also think that given the way Robert crafted the Calabar character and the dynamic between the two of them, it makes, for me, I can buy that relationship in the time period we're looking at without any problem.
And I guess that's, maybe we can talk a little bit broader about, both of you gentlemen, we can see behind Chuck, all the ones with his name on them have written in this Ring of Fire universe quite a bit. What is that like? Because you're balancing real life events and real characters, as we've discussed, and then these fictional characters, but now it's become this, I use this term, web of, it's not just your fictional character, and then you're creating people that have to slot in. And what is that like, balancing all of that? And then also making it feel authentic to the period, but it's not really the period, because they have this modern influence as well. And I think, and I guess maybe we can segue into is that part of why you guys think this series, we're now on, well, this is number 30, but we've got more. I mean, I've already entered in, the next few. We're 30 plus novels, as well as all the Grantville stuff. Is that part of the appeal, is how all these things interact, do you think?
Well, it certainly is to me. I mean, when I started working in the series in, I think, 2010, 2011, I've always been interested in history. So the history part of it, as far as diving into the history, and that was not an issue. And I've always been interested in maybe diving into the military aspects of it in some ways. I've always enjoyed that. I'm a big war gamer. I work in the gaming industry, so it's just an area that I really enjoy. But I probably, if it was just historical, and if it didn't have some element of uptime characters, or maybe situations that have come across the Atlantic into the Caribbean, into thing where there's very few uptimers in this novel, in Calabar's War. It's almost primarily done from the point of view of downtimers, but the sensibility is still beginning to be felt. You know what I'm saying? The notion of ending slavery, and the need to improve Jewish life in the New World and stuff like that. If it didn't have that, if I couldn't draw upon some of that modern feel, I probably wouldn't write it as well as I do, because I feel comfortable being able to deal with issues, because I can play them off of each other. I can say this is a modern sense of how to deal with slavery. These people are against it, and it makes sense to them. It's part of their lifestyle. It's part of their whole livelihood. And then you can play off of them, and you can create tension between those two dynamics that I think this series, and maybe other alternate history series, does, but this series in particular, because of so many uptimers around, really gives the author the opportunity to explore those kinds of things, uptime sensibilities versus downtime sensibilities, and you can have a lot of fun with it.
Mhm.
Yeah, from my standpoint, I'm sitting here and thinking what is probably something vaguely like a macro genre heretical thought. By which I mean, now that I've introduced this puzzling neologism,
Right.
You know, when I read straight historical novels, I'm always struck by the fact that, you know, first of all, there's the real, and then there's verisimilitude. An author is courting disaster, if not professional suicide, by sticking with the real, because the real is frankly not usually very exciting. There's very little in the way of denouement or closure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Narrative is something, I don't want to go too far with this idea, but I think it's rightly said that narrative is in many ways something, it's a reconstruction of what happened in the way we think of it, not so much the way we experienced it.
Okay.
The events are much more orderly as dominoes in retrospect than in the moment that they're falling. And the thing about straight history books is it has this problem that it's the need to make it understandable to somebody of modern sensibilities means, to my mind, that it is very hard to go back probably beyond, and I'm being generous, I think 1780, 1770, without saying, well, that's just not how they thought.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have those idioms. There are assumptions, there are even first notions that have not been had yet. You know, the age of reason is in mid stride. The age of enlightenment is sort of finally taking hold in terms of in terms of what its longer arc consequences are going to be. And it's always sort of, I don't dare stand away too far from a straight historical novel as a novelist without saying, I don't know if I buy this. Mm-hmm. But the weird thing is that here, the novel that represents a reality that, so far as we know, could not possibly take place, actually feels more genuine. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is it's getting to what Robert was said. There are these modern sensibilities, characters who are born from them, but then this other wave of characters who are being influenced by them, who've read this or thought about that. And at that point, it's almost like a first contact novel sort of being played out over a long period of time where the contact between the two species, that each one is rubbing off a little bit on the other. And they're engaged in this trading pastiche of well, I took this from you, but I did it my own way. That whole sort of thing. And that's, I think, for me, one of the things that keeps this fresh, but also it feels as though if this happened, our verisimilitude is closer to the real than our verisimilitude is when we're writing something straight history from the same period. Because how do you convert the modern mindset and all its assumptions into a novel set in our historical 1630 and have it be believable or understandable? You're gonna run into one of those problems. It's either true to the period, and it's like, what? With like footnotes longer than it be, longer than the actual text itself, or it's not going to pass the historical sniff test, as it were. So it's in answer to your almost forgotten question, at least for me, is it's not so much of a challenge as it's a liberation. Oh. It's a way to play with human thought and the way things might have been. There's probably a lot of hard work to it, but I think the excitement tends to make it. You don't remember that part of it.
Yeah. That's a really interesting way to think about it, and I think you put that really eloquently. And when I sort of my feelings when I read this stuff and how I feel about it and what does draw me into it, because Robert said he's a big history buff, but sort of like initially years ago when I first started this, I'm like, 1600s Europe, it's cool, I guess. But then you get into it and it really does. I think a lot of that whatever, you get the point. I'm not, my words are, whatever, are failing me, but it just is, it's just such a unique take. And again, I think the brilliance of Eric opening it up to other people, so that it could have, because, obviously one person could not, I don't think, write all of this, certainly. And as you said earlier, Chuck, different people come in and bring different ideas that influence things, and the ripple going out as far as it does. And like you said, in this novel, there's very few people from the uptime, but yet we feel their presence throughout it. Is there anything else that we missed, or is there any further plans for Calabar? Have we seen the last of him, or what's next for you, gentlemen?
Well, I certainly hope that there's more plans for him. I certainly have ideas for that. It's going to have to work itself into the timeline at some point, though, and hopefully sooner rather than later. I'm going to begin to do it. I have definitely. I mean, at the end of the novel. Well, I'm not going to spoil the end of the novel. I'm not going to say anything. That would not be appropriate and wise. But there is definitely room for expansion, and hopefully, I'll be able to do it. I certainly have ideas for him. I mean, Calabar, when Chuck found him in his research with Commander Cantrell and introduced him initially in Commander Cantrell for a very short period of time, he's an important part of the New World series now, New World portion of the series, and so he's got something to do, something to say, and hopefully we'll be able to do so.
And what are you coming out with next, Robert?
Yeah.
Oh, what am I coming out with next?
Yeah.
I do have. Well, I had a novel come out last December, which I would like to mention. It's not a Baen novel, unfortunately, but
it's okay.
It's good. It's called The Last Hurrah. It was published by Winged Hussar Publishing, which is a small press that has that does novels, media tie-in novels for Mantic Games. Mantic is a miniatures game, wargaming company, and the novel that I wrote, The Last Hurrah, is based upon their board game Dreadball. So it's a sports novel, and it's about that event. And so that came out in December. So anybody who's interested in taking a look at that can go up on Amazon and just search The Last Hurrah, Robert E. Waters, and you'll find it. I don't have anything coming out right away, but I do have something that will be published. It's going to be republished in the next Grantville Gazette. Grantville Gazette 9, I think, is the one.
I think that's.
I have I have one of the short stories that I published in the Grantville Gazette is going to be in there. I think that one's called the Letters from Incheon. It's about a veteran from the Korean War who came back. He's one of the members of Grantville. And it's about his story. And then Eric Brown and I have a story that is going to appear in 1637, The Coast of Chaos. We wrote a story about dealing with the relationship and the political situation of the Algonquin up in Rhode Island and Connecticut. So that story is going to be part of that thing. And then a longer term, a little further down the road, Eric Flint and I are actually working on one of the mainline novels. Chuck's going to have the other one. So it's splintering now. It's going in two different directions. Eric and I are going in one direction. Chuck will go in another direction. And we're working on that, and that's coming along really well.
All right. Chuck, I know you've got your new fantasy series coming up. I should say to the people, I may have said this on the podcast before, I do a lot of the it's not important for me, but I'm always like a few seasons ahead. I can't ever remember what's come out and what has. So I'm always like, that came out last year, like it come out next year, David. So anyway, so what have you got coming up?
The sort of the run up to this was just last month. The second book in my dyad in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising came out. The novel last year was At the End of the World, and this one was At the End of the Journey. And that's apparently pleasing people. So I'm happy. I'm certainly not. No one can be John Ringo except for John Ringo, but apparently I have found an acceptable voice for his audience.
Yeah, it's good. I one thumbs up. I think it's a great series.
And so, of course, this There's a constant rollout from Murphy's Lawless, which is Beyond Terra Press, which is an imprint of Chris Kennedy publications. That is not a side arc so much as a occasionally crossing arc with the Kane Riordan universe novels. It was sort of designed and conceived of as a little bit less big idea and intrigue, and more sort of dead ahead ripping yarns. And the second season, which is to say the second year, has just kicked off this past month, and is being very well received. We'll do two. Last year we did one goat choker of a novel, and this year we're doing it instead as two smaller ones, each which are sort of three novellas braided together, and then I come in, add things, and there were other parts which were not included within those original novellas that turn it into a satisfyingly large novel. Then, as you say, at the end of the year, David, I have the first novel in the Vortex of World series coming out, which is called This Broken World. And I won't say much about that, except that it will be immediately recognizable, the classical influences of the epic fantasy tradition to everybody who's familiar with that tradition, and then be prepared to have all of that stood on its head.
All right. Well, that should whet people's appetite, certainly. We're looking forward to that, I know, around the office. So, gentlemen.
Well, it's got a dragon, right? So.
Hey, there you go. Can't be bad. Thank you so much. I'm going to hold the book up one more time. 1636, Calabar's War. It is out now in trade paperback and ebook. You can go to Baen.com and wherever you get your books and ebooks from, he'll have it available. Chuck and Robert, thank you so much for coming on the Baen Free Radio Hour today. It's been a great conversation with y'all.
Thank you. Great seeing you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And now another installment in our ongoing audiobook serialization of David Weber's Uncompromising Honor. Honor keeps her promise. The Solarian League. For hundreds of years, they have borne the banner of human civilization. But the bureaucratic mandarins who rule today's league are corrupt and looking for scapegoats. They've decided the upstart star kingdom of Manticore must be annihilated. Uncompromising courage. Honor Harrington has worn the Star Kingdom's uniform for half a century. Very few know war the way Honor Harrington does. So far, hers has been a voice of caution. But now, the Mandarins have committed atrocities such as the galaxy has not known in 1,000 years. They have finally killed too many of the people Honor Harrington loves. Uncompromising vengeance. Now, Honor Harrington is coming for the Solarian League, and hell is riding in her wake.
BSDS Hawthorne. Beowulf Planetary Orbit. Beowulf System. Sorry, Skipper. I know you don't want any comms that aren't essential, but I think you'd better take this one. Captain John Neitz looked up from his cup of coffee and tried not to scowl at his executive officer. Commander Badaloti and he had been friends for years, and the XO's eyes were as exhausted as his own. They were also apologetic. Why is that, David? It came out testier than he'd intended it to, and he shook his head in a quick apology of his own. Sorry. No sweat, Skip, Badaloti said. But, like I say, I think you'll want to take this one. It's Christina. Neat set his cup in the holder on his command chair's arm and inhaled. For once, I think you're right about something, he said with a weary smile, and Badaloti's lips twitched in brief response. Then Neitz looked over his shoulder at the comm officer. Patch it through to my Unilink, please, Carla. Yes, sir. Neitz leaned back in his command chair. It was one of the most comfortable chairs in the known galaxy, but somehow it wasn't quite capable of feeling that way for a body as tired as his was. John, a beloved voice said in his ear, and he closed his eyes while he savored it. Hi, honey, he responded. I hate to disturb you, Christina Neitz said. I know you're all exhausted and going crazy up there. There are disturbances, and then there are disturbances, sweetheart. He shook his head, even though she couldn't see it. Trust me, this is one I don't mind. In fact, it's one I think I need. It must be like visiting hell, she said softly. You got that one right, babe, he replied. My God, you got that one right. She was silent for a moment, and Neitz could almost physically feel her reaching across the thousands of kilometers of vacuum between BSDS Hawthorne and Columbia. Christina was a senior attorney in the Directorate of Justice, and things must be almost as crazy in her office as they were up here, he thought. Her boss, Devora Ophir Giacconi, the board of directors solicitor, and her senior deputy had both been aboard Beowulf Alpha. He wasn't sure who Ophir Giacconi's surviving senior deputy was now, but a hellacious workload had to be coming down on Christina, too. There was a lot of that going around. 6 days. That was how long had passed since the Beowulf strike. 6 days of nightmare labor, and a huge part of that had landed on Hawthorne. She was one of the Beowulf System Defense Force's Whitethorn-class rescue ships, superbly designed and equipped for search and rescue operations under the most difficult conditions imaginable. But there were only 8 of them in the entire SDF, and no one had ever imagined conditions like this. No wonder Badaloti and all of Nitz's people were so exhausted. No really big chunks of wreckage had gotten through to the planet, thank God. There'd been no major surface strikes, no tsunamis like the one which had killed his third cousin and her family in Yawata. The block ships, which had been unable to protect the habitats, had at least managed to intercept their broken bones before that happened. Not that plenty of bits and pieces still in orbit didn't pose potential threats. One of the first things Search and Rescue Command had done was to plot vectors for all the larger chunks of debris. Those which had threatened other habitats had been intercepted first, but scores of others tumbled on new, highly eccentric orbits that swooped low enough to graze the fringe of atmosphere. Those would have to be dealt with soon as well, before they lost sufficient velocity to nosedive to the surface like the lost hammer of Thor. Most of the debris threatened no one, though, not immediately. And God alone knew how many pieces of that debris had once been human beings. Nitz's jaw tightened at that thought. The debris pattern, coupled with the sensor records of the actual event, made it clear the charges had been placed with vicious forethought. Law enforcement and military intelligence were only starting their relentless assault on how it had been done, but at least a dozen competing theories had already emerged. Personally, Neitz went with what was generally regarded as the most probable. The devices had to have been in one of the central cargo hubs aboard each habitat. It was the only way to account for the wreckage patterns, and those hubs had been located at the cores of the enormous platform's personnel sections. That was why the bastards had taken that approach, chosen those locations for some innocuous, well-camouflaged crate or container. A cargo canister in one of the open space orbital holding areas would have inflicted little, probably even no damage when it detonated. Even one of the long-term controlled condition storage booms would have provided sufficient separation for much of something as massive as Beowulf Alpha had been, to survive. But not in the cargo hubs. They'd been deliberately located as conveniently as possible to the places where people lived. "How much longer, honey?" Christina asked in his ear, and his nostrils flared. "However long it takes." It came out much more harshly than he'd intended. "Lord, I'm sorry," he said a moment later, his tone contrite. "It's just that we can't quit. We just can't." "I know. And I shouldn't push for answers you can't give me anyway. I know that, too." He could picture that small, loving, half-apologetic smile perfectly. "It's just that we miss you down here." "Miss you, too," he said. But he knew what she was really thinking. It had been almost a T-week, an entire T-week. Hawthorne alone had recovered over 600 bodies so far, and that wasn't even her primary mission. He had no idea how many had been recovered by search and rescue small craft, and he didn't want to know, not really. But that wasn't Hawthorne's job. Her teams were out amid the densest parts of the debris field in her specialized salvage shuttles, threading their way through the 1,000-ton chunks of alloy, cutting their way into compartments that might still be intact, searching desperately for someone who might still be alive. So far, they'd found 16. 16. And they weren't going to find any more of them. He'd made himself accept that 24 hours ago. Anyone who'd been trapped in one of those compartments had run out of air or heat or power long since. But that didn't mean they'd stop looking. No one left behind. That was Search and Rescue's motto, and they would, by God, keep the faith. No matter what, no matter who, they'd honor that trust. I'm sorry to say that the real reason I calmed you is that I just heard from Lizzie, Christina said after a moment, and Neitz frowned. Lizzie, Elizabeth, was their daughter, a student at Hippocrates University. She'd been safely on the other side of the planet when Alpha blew up, so why? Lizzie? He repeated. Yes. Christina paused, almost as if she was gathering her strength. She just found out Felicia Cummings, Tim Kwan, Katsuko Johnson, and half a dozen of her other friends were at the Broken Arrow concert. Neitz closed his eyes in sudden pain. Broken Arrow. He remembered how hard he'd tried to get Lizzie a ticket to the band's live concert. She shouldn't have been going, not with midterms coming up this week, but he'd known how badly she'd wanted to, and he'd been bitterly disappointed when he found out he'd waited too long. Then, before all 40,000 concert-goers died with the rest of Beowulf Alpha, and Katsuko, who'd been Lizzie's best friend since nursery school. Oh, sweet Jesus, he whispered. I know. He heard the tears glittering in his wife's voice. You know what she's like. She's visiting Katsuko's mom right now, and then she's headed over to the Kwans. She's like you. She has to be there for people. Neitz nodded silently. He knew exactly what his daughter was doing at that moment, despite her own terrible grief. I just wanted you to know, Christina went on. You know she's not going to mention it to you, certainly not while you're still up there, but I figured... You figured I should know before she and I have a chance to talk about it, he finished for her. Because the last thing either of us need is for me to say something that hurts her all over again. And because you're a good mom and a better wife. We're both lucky to have you. Oh, I've always known that, she said with a slightly watery chuckle, and he smiled wearily. Well, at least I've finally started figuring it out too, he said. Wouldn't want to say I could be a little Priority signal, Lieutenant Simpkins Howard announced suddenly from communications, and Nita's eyes popped open. Gotta run, honey. Go, Christina said, and promise me you'll try to get at least a little rest? Love you, he said, instead of issuing any promises he knew he couldn't keep. Then he killed the Unilink and swiveled his chair to face communications. What is it, Carla? It's the bosun, sir. Charlie 3's reporting a live suit beacon. A live beacon? Yes, sir. Badaloti leaned forward, looking over the sensor officer of the watch's shoulder. Now he straightened and turned to face Neitz. That's sure as hell what it looks like, Skipper, he said. One of platform engineering suits from the transponder code. After this long? Where's it been for the last week? It's gotta be some kind of sensor glitch. Don't know where it's been, sir, but it's Bosun Locken. Badaloti twitched a tired smile. If you want, I can ask him to double-check. Bad idea, Neitz said, shaking his head. Senior Master Chief Petty Officer Bill Locken, Hawthorne's senior NCO, had been in search and rescue since the year Captain John Neitz graduated from high school. He was the best wreck diver Neitz had ever met, which was the reason he and Charlie 3, Neitz's most experienced shuttle crew, were the point of Hawthorne's spear. If he said he was picking up a signal, he was picking up a signal. Which didn't explain why no one had picked it up sooner. The bosun does say it's coming from inside a real rat's nest of wreckage, Skipper. Badaloti continued, as if he'd heard his captain's thought. In fact, if I had to guess, the problem's how deep it is, how much junk it has to punch through. That's got to be why he didn't spot it earlier. What's the status of the survivor? We don't know there is a survivor yet. Badalodi's excitement waned visibly. All the bosun's got so far is the beacon. He says there's no telemetry, or if there is, it's not getting through anyway. He's working on it. Understood. Neitz inhaled. No wonder Badalodi's initial exhilaration had faded. Skin-suit beacons were designed to be incredibly powerful, but suit telemetry channels were shorter ranged and considerably weaker. If the wreckage around it had been sufficient to block it for so long, it was entirely possible there was telemetry and it just couldn't get through. But it was far, far more likely that no telemetry was getting through because there was no one alive, at least, inside the suit in question. Stay on it, David, he said after a moment, and tell Bosun Locken to keep us informed. I know he will anyway, but God, I could use some good news for a change. Yes, sir, Badalodi said. We all could.
That was another installment in David Weber's Honor Harrington masterpiece, Uncompromising Honor. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Praise, thanks, and gratitude to Charles E. Gannon and Robert E. Waters for sitting down with me today to talk about their new novel, 1636, Calabar's War. And thanks, as always, to our regular host, Mr. Tony Daniel, for letting me sit in this week. Tony is actually on a much-deserved vacation right now. I think he really needed the rest and relaxation to get away from all the stress. I mean, the guy's a father, a husband, full-time editor, a writer, and of course he does the podcast almost every week. He really needed to relax. I know he was a little bit worried because the red-eye flight he was taking was supposed to be flying through a thunderstorm, but they assured him he could just lean back, look out the window, enjoy the show, and everything would be fine. But I'm a little worried. I woke up this morning and I found a text that he'd apparently sent last night sometime mid-flight. It was in all capital letters, and it just said, "Something is out there on the wing." Doesn't sound very relaxing to me. I hope he got it all figured out. I'm sure he'll let us know about it when he's back next week. Until then, I'm David Afsharirad, coming to you from a soundproof bunker somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Join us here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.